a problem. Now, Fukuyama, on the other hand, famously gave what I like to call a neo-Marxist interpretation of the West's victory in the Cold War, but did so in a kind of conservative guise. The hero of his article and book is an obscure to the public, but less obscure in intellectual circles, Russian-born French bureaucrat and philosopher by the name of Alexander Kojève, who way back in the 1930s provided the intellectual framework for what Kojève called the universal homogeneous state. The universal homogeneous state would be the true victory of reason and universality in human affairs. At various times in his life and career, Kojève identified this universal homogeneous state with Stalin's Russia, with the European community, and with the economic and political hegemony of the United States. These were three competing ways of seeing the victory of universality, a universal state in human affairs. What Fukuyama did is say, well, Kojève was wrong to identify the universal state, at least at one time in his thought with the Soviet Union. In fact, the West's victory in the Cold War reveals liberal capitalist democracy to be the uncontested and only legitimate ideology and political form in the contemporary world. In other words, the Marxists were right that history had a meaning, a telos, a movement, but they were wrong to identify that meaning, telos, or movement with communism. In fact, liberal democracy was the true meaning of the human adventure. With the implosion of European communism between 1889 and 1991, history in principle was over. All right. So that's a problematic form of universalism, right? That understated in a pretty important way, I think, the continuing divisions in the world, religious, cultural, political, and that also, I think, misunderstood the real meaning of the West's victory in the Cold War. Because in important respects, the West's victory in the Cold War was a defeat for the very idea of the universal homogeneous state. It was a victory for property and tradition and religion and the nation against the kind of fraudulent universality represented by communism. All right, so this is my little sort of talk before my talk, just highlighting, I think, two contemporary frameworks that failed to do justice to the complicated mix of universality and particularity that define the Western tradition. Now I want to move on to the sort of core of my talk. And to begin with, I want to reflect on what I call the plural sources of Western liberty. Okay? It seems to me to think about civilization in its Western form is to be aware of the multiple sources that inform our civilizational tradition. And any effort to sort of undo Brad Watson had one version of that mixture of Lockean contractualism with a more traditional and customary elements in the West. What we see today in many ways is an effort to emphasize one aspect of that tradition, the tradition of contract, the tradition of choice, human rights, to the detriment of the sort of rich, multiple, or plural sources of Western civilization. So what are the sources of the distinctive vitality of Western civilization? 19th century French liberal statesman historian François Guizot located that vitality in the dynamic pluralism of a Western world that had avoided the stagnation that accompanied despotism in all its forms. Roman law and municipal freedom, the Christian religion, and the fierce independence of the German barbarian tribes coalesced to form a dynamic, free, and intellectually vibrant civilization. in his magisterial, The History of Civilization in Europe, which I think is the best book written on the West. Synthetic, philosophical, historical book written in the West, and which is no longer available in print in English, published in 1828. Guizot argued that, quote, the excessively predominating dominion of a single principle, of a single form, has been the cause of tyranny, unquote, in other civilizations, while, quote, in Europe, liberty has been the result of the variety of the elements of civilization and of the state of struggle in which they have constantly existed, unquote. It was lively coexistence of social forms and contents of life that contributed to what Guizot called, he would not get tenure at Stanford for this line, the real and immense superiority of European civilization. The real and immense superiority of European civilization. In contrast, as I said a moment ago, modern Western democracies tend to define liberty in terms of the single imperatives of consent or human rights, downplaying these rich and plural traditions that were responsible for the human greatness of the Western world. Today, we overemphasize individual autonomy and ignore the important role played by religious traditions, by the moral law, in restraining rulers and reminding citizens of their larger obligations. In his writings on the Western tradition of political philosophy, Leo Strauss emphasized how the antagonism between Greek philosophy and biblical religion was central to the development of Western civilization. In his view, the unresolvable tension between reason and revelation is the deepest source of the continuing vitality of Western civilization. If this tension between what is represented by each of Jerusalem and Athens were ever definitively resolved, then Western civilization would be in jeopardy. In other words, if the West is to survive, there can be and will be no end of history. The French medievalist Remy Brague, in an important book, L'Europe, le voie romaine, it's been translated into 21 languages, even into English. It's translated with a bad title, Eccentric Culture. In this book, he's broadened this dialectic of Straussian dialectic of reason and revelation by highlighting the crucial role of Rome in mediating the tension between Jerusalem and Athens. Both pagan and Christian Rome opened themselves up to what was outside themselves, thus giving shape to a Europe whose sources, Jerusalem on the one hand, Athens on the other, were extrinsic to itself, outside of itself. Brague argues that Islamic civilization lacked a similar vehicle of openness. Despite efforts to appropriate the Jewish patriarchs and prophets and Christ himself for the cause of Islam, its adherents were not encouraged or even allowed to confront Jewish and Christian scriptures on their own terms. Put that in a little less fancy way, in the Quran, you come across figures named Abraham and Miriam and Moses, etc. But they turn out not to be the comparable figures that one confronts in the Hebrew scriptures. The stories are retold, right? And so there's a kind of appropriation of the great Jewish prophets and patriarchs, but they're different people. They've been appropriated for the Islamic cause. Likewise, everyone knows that Muslims consider Jesus to be a great prophet, and they even honor Miriam, his mother. But the fact is, this Jesus is not the Jesus who died on the cross. He's not the Jesus as Christians understand that Jesus, the person of Jesus. And of course, Muslims are actively discouraged from reading the New Testament, as they are discouraged from reading the Old Testament.